But yeah, so my presentation, I will maybe say more later of what I do in specific, but my presentation is an introduction, of course, to the idea of degrowth, and in particular for cities, what it means for cities. And it's two parts. One is I understand some general introduction about the term, what degrowth, post-growth means, related to green growth. So maybe a bit of a repetition, but I hope it will frame the second part, which is what my work is focusing on, which is really the implication for cities, urban change, urban transformations, and the way we live in cities. So that's my focus as an urban scholar. So the first thing I always start saying is, what is the difference between post-growth and degrowth? Because they're not exactly the same. So the way I define post-growth is somehow an approach. It's basically arguing that infinite GDP growth in a finite planet, it's impossible. It's basically starting from this assumption. So when we talk about growth, we talk about GDP as a main measure of growth, which is the measure of all economic transaction within a society and an economy. So when we talk about post-growth, we basically say those transactions cannot grow infinitively forever because the resources, the material resources of the economy, where the economy takes place, are limited. It's the planet. So this is a post-growth statement. And it's already good to do this, to start saying this, which already closes up a lot of discussions. However, when we do this statement, we don't say much else than what we need to do else. So we could argue that we have no infinite growth, but we might have a steady state economy. Degrowth does one step further. It says not only we cannot grow forever, but we need to actually reduce our economy. We need to downscale it. We need to actively, deliberately, and democratically downscale the economy. So that's the statement that degrowth does. It's a step further. And often, this step is not done also because as soon as we talk about downscaling, all kind of big elephants in the room appear, like, okay, where do we take, who should give more, who should give less, where do we downscale, are we all gonna lose houses, and everybody gets scared. So that's why degrowth, I think it's a more strong term, which really gives us a direction, because it tells us to downscale. So that's how I use the two terms. So let's immediately define it. And this is the slide with the most text, I'm sorry. But I think it's good to define what degrowth is. So if we go together through this text, we will see it. Degrowth is a planned downscaling. So first of all, it's planned. It's not a random downscaling. That's a recession. That's a recession where people suffer, they don't have jobs, and it's a disaster. Degrowth, it's planned and it's deliberately done to do so. Of all activities that are environmentally harmful, so environment, and socially alienated. So all activities that divide society, that makes us machines rather than humans. And important to say, starting from those that are less necessary for well-being. This aspect of necessary activities is very important also to open discussion. What is necessary, what is not. Finally, to do so, it requires a change in the social values that basically enable the slowing down of consumption and production, and also that tackle the ideology of competition that today drives economic growth. So it's also a story of social change and social norms. So how we relate to each other, how we relate to our personal well-being. How do we see our personal well-being? However, degrowth is not about reduction only, it's also about increase. Again, a planned increase of all activities that regenerate the ecosystem and improve social well-being. So it's active task, active strategy of increasing those activities. This means growing, in fact, the so-called economy of care, education, and creativity. It's a general label that identifies all kinds of activities which are socially necessary for both people and the environment. This is made possible through a program of redistribution of wealth and regenerative design. Maybe you know about Kate Raworth. She had this big, not very famous book, and she really uses the term redistribution and regeneration as two of the key terms to guide a future economic organization. She's an economist. So these are the two things. So when we talk about degrowth, don't be scared. It's not only about reducing, but it's also about increasing other things, and that's very important. Now, the easiest way to understand degrowth is to set it against the idea of green growth. Degrowth criticizes three main ideals of contemporary society. The first is that economic growth is good for society and is good for us as people. It makes us better people. That's the first critique. Degrowth says, well, not true, and I will explain later. The second is that that economic growth can be decoupled from environmental degradation. In this map, you see basically an illustration of what decoupling means. Green growers says that we can first relatively decouple GDP growth from environmental damage. That's the second block of the image. So basically, the economy grows, the environmental damage slows down, but still grows. And the absolute decoupling basically says that we can grow infinitively and reduce the impact on the economy. That's the second statement of degrowth, is that absolute decoupling is not happening. There is no evidence of that. There is evidence of relative decoupling, correct. The third is that the third assumption is of green growth that degrowth criticizes is that we do need economic growth to become sustainable. Mm-hmm. So just only by increasing our economic power, we can realize all the infrastructure that we need to be green. That's the statement that the green growth argues and that degrowth rejects. And I will give you some example of that as well. This is an image that shows the relative decoupling. From 1965 to today, we see actually that GDP grew at least 6 times, and the CO2 emissions in this case relatively grow less. So there is a relative decoupling, but these emissions are growing still, and they are not reducing at the pace necessary to halt climate breakdown. So that's the first evidence. However, and here's the trick, if we take the materials that are used in society, not the CO2 only, but all materials, to make our clothes, these tables, the buildings, we see that there is no relative decoupling. So we see that still we consume more proportionally to the gross domestic product, or in this case, the world product. So also materials increase.
So CO2 a bit?
A bit.
Material use,
yeah.
Maybe biodiversity loss, you can
yes, also. Yeah.
Graph is not...
It's not reducing.
It's parallel.
It's a bit of the reason why I always get a bit annoyed when we only talk about CO2. It's not only about CO2, it's about all kind of biodiversity loss, environmental destruction that is caused by the extraction of materials with which we build also sustainable energy infrastructure. This is another image. It's a bit dated, but it's just to show you when we talk about footprint, we don't only look at carbon footprint, which indeed is slightly now, this is old image, but it's actually going down a bit. But we see that actually we are crossing the biocapacity of the Earth by the non-carbon footprint. And I think this is very relevant for urban scholars, urban activists, because it is what cities are made of. Energy, of course, but also materials, and those materials are not decreasing. There is no relative decoupling, and let alone absolute.
So non-carbon footprint is talks about other resources,
exactly.
But also about our pollution. So, for example,
yes. Yeah, the footprint is a complex measure which includes also the earth you need to process your waste, for example, and also to process all kind of other waste. So it's very complex measure that honestly I don't know how to measure, but it is a useful measure that goes beyond CO2. Now this is the story that degrowth is trying to, of course, tackle. But degrowth also brings in the social dimension. You remember I defined it as starting from the less necessary activities. Here you see a graph made by Oxfam, very famous graph, that shows that this footprint that we talked about before is also not equally distributed in society. Actually, we know that about the richest 10% of society globally produces 50% of all the emissions. And actually, the bottom 50% produces 10% of all the emissions. That's a global map. But also, if we take, for example, the global north or countries like the Netherlands, we know that this is equally unevenly distributed. For example, we know there was an article recently in Et Parool that 10% of the richest in the Netherlands owns about 65% of the wealth. So it's also in countries like this one that we see this inequality of wealth and environmental impact of that wealth. Actually, Oxfam just published a few days ago another report that says that a billionaire emits 1 million times more than an average person in the UK. And how do they do so? Of course, they don't eat 1 million times more. They don't have 1 million square meters more. They do it with their scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, let's call it that way. So basically, all those emissions and materials used by their investments. So billionaires, what is the main asset where they invest? What do you think? I guess there is no billionaire here, but
Real estate?
Not yet.
real estate, buildings. So buildings is the prime asset for billionaires' investments, and it's also, as I will show in a second, the most environmentally impactful. The critique to green growth of degrowth also tackles the social aspect, as I said. They also focus on the statement number 1, that economic growth is good for us. Well, when we do research on well-being and happiness and human development indexes, we also notice that actually infinite economic growth doesn't translate to infinite well-being. There is a curve that at one point kind of flattens down. The left image shows, for example, the relation between GDP per person and the satisfaction of life. And you see basically that above a certain level, which is a minimum level necessary to be fine, of course, you see that there is no actually very much added value of extra GDP points. You see basically that the curve flattens. So you can grow your economy a lot, but people will not feel more happy. If we do analysis of what people like also, what people think it's important in their life, we also see that they will never say, consuming more, buying more cars or buying more stuff makes me happy. Most of the people usually say, my family, my friends, my social relations, the good environment at work, these things are what makes people feeling well. I mean, it may sound obvious, but this is not what GDP calculates. If we all go to the psychologist tomorrow, psychotherapist, with a burnout, we increase GDP. If we smoke, we increase GDP. If we, buy, stuff that makes no sense, like souvenirs, completely bad souvenirs, whatever, we increase GDP. So economic growth does not qualify how we feel. That's the other critique. So just to wrap up, degrowth is a mode of, let's call it, socioeconomic organization that, first, pursues well-being directly, not as a proxy of economic wealth. So it's not about growth and then trickling down to well-being. It's about just focusing on well-being first. To do so, it focuses on basic human needs rather than material consumption. That's important too. Third, it's a project that increases all those non-material activities that are actually socially empowering and increasing well-being, but do not impact on the environment. Stuff like this fits very well the degrowth story. We're not consuming stuff now.
practice what you preach.
Yes. I mean, I have to say, the education sector is also a very important one in this story. And finally, to do that, it enables redistribution of wealth. And to do that, it starts by reducing excess. So all the things that are non-necessary and that have high impact on the environment, all those necessary consumptions and productions. That's a downscaling priority for degrowth. So cities are extremely important for this project. Actually, most of degrowth scholarship doesn't deal with cities. There are very few people, and we all know, we know each other in Europe, and it's just 10 people perhaps that wrote about cities and degrowth. So it is a new field, but it's extremely crucial for that. First of all, we know, for example, that cities cover only 2% of the world's surface, but actually consume 75% of all materials. So it's a lot of stuff going through cities. They are the major sites of consumption of materials. Also, wealth is very localized in cities. The top 600 cities cover almost 2/3 of the economy. And there are some cities like London, Tokyo, of course, New York, that are extremely high in concentration of wealth and investments. By the way, this is not only a global north, global south. China today, as 3 cities of China are today in the top 10 of the most wealthy cities of the world. So China is coming strong too there. And also we know that cities, since the 80s, since the change in the post-industrial economy, became the growth machines of the economy. So if a state GDP increases, it's because cities GDP increases. They are the motor of the economy. That's where the highest transactions are made. That's where the highest incomes are. That's where the highest consumption is located. And when I talk about cities, of course, I talk about city regions, not inner cities. And finally, they are very important because, in fact, all the prefigurative practices of degrowth that we know are taking place. Many of those are taking place in cities. There is a small minority of works that show people that leave the city to be degrowth, the so-called back to the lander movement. That's a minority, and it might look a bit like this kind of a new age thing to do, and grow your crops and things like this. But of course, that's one way to look at degrowth. There is a lot of practices that take place in cities. Most of them regard biking, slow mobility, pedestrianizing, of course, also housing co-ops, urban gardens. These are the most known examples of degrowth. As I will say in a second, it's not enough. Just briefly, 2 more graphs, sorry for that. Cities are also growing massively, and we know that there will be, by 2050, the double of raw materials needed for that. Just to give you an idea of the scale, in Africa, by 2050, there will be 800% increase of materials for the built environment in Africa. In China, 300%. In Europe, about 40%. So the urbanization challenge and the impact on the environment is massive. It's massive. And also cities are big producers of waste, of course. And that's also, we see that industrial waste is decreasing. Companies are very good in circularly reuse their waste, but cities still produce large masses of waste. In Europe, still, it's every year more waste. Now, many advocates of urban smart growth or green growth or good growth, call it as you like, will tell you, no, CO2 emissions in cities are going down, the air quality is improving, we are electrifying, we are getting better. True, that's true, but that's just because we know the costs of that transition are being moved somewhere else. The smart economy of cities creates dramatic situations in waste dumps, and also electrification of cars without a reduction of car mobility will require more energy. And that's where the problem comes. It's been estimated that if the entire surface of cities of the world would be covered with solar panels, we could cover only 2% of the energy that cities need. So It's also, that's the degrowth story versus the green growth story. The materials needed for producing 1 kilowatt-hour of renewable energy are 10 times more the one of coal. So we need more materials to produce the same amount of energy. This is a paradox, but it does show that transition to a green economy, fully electrified, fully renewable, will not work if we do not downscale the economy. And there will be, of course, all kind of scarcity of materials for the renewable energy production, like the lithium, the nickel. In 2040, there will be 42 times more lithium needed to produce solar panels and batteries. So indeed, electrifying cities, good, yes, it's not enough, and that's the degrowth story. We also need to downscale also material consumption, energy consumption in cities. It's quite a challenge. Again, we just talked about construction very briefly. Construction is one of the main challenges for us, I think, as urban planners, designers, because it is indeed one of the major motors of GDP. If we slow down construction, GDP slows down. Very important to say. It's the one with the largest footprint. It's the sector with the largest footprint. Just for example, it's 1/4 of all air pollution comes just for construction and for, of course, production of materials for construction. And it produces also 60% of all total waste. It's from construction and demolition. So I think there is a very strong sector where we can try to find an impact on how to slow down that sector of the economy. Now, let's talk more about what are the implications of this for cities. This is a graph that shows how post-growth ideas, not degrowth, post-growth have been used in some cities in Europe. It's the donut of Kate Raworth. We know it also from Amsterdam, Bristol, I think, Barcelona, other cities. Basically there cities are looked as indeed as spaces of material consumption and unequal wealth. And the argument there is that we need to downscale, of course, those sectors of cities where we overshoot. And we need to upscale, so to increase those sectors where people are not meeting basic standards. And I think this tells very clearly what is the degrowth story, that we need to reduce somewhere, increase somewhere else. So for city makers, I think that's a good way to look at the thing. Taking from somewhere and putting back where it's needed. How do we do that? What are the principles that we can use? So now we get a bit more, let's say, technical, but it's good. And I think we can discuss about many of these ideas. So the first things that I would like to explain is, if we look at cities and degrowth, we first need to find out how cities grow. So it's not enough to say, okay, we're going to put bikes everywhere or trees everywhere, urban gardens. That's not enough, of course. We need to really rethink the system of how cities work and how the built environment is produced. So when we look at how cities grow, I think we see three processes that I think identify how cities function in a growth-dependent economy. The first is the so-called functional specialization. So when we look at city regions, we see that areas of city regions tend to specialize on specific sectors of the economy, like Silicon Valley or like food production. They tend to specialize, and of course, all the economic activities tend to rotate around that sector. This makes city regions relatively low in autonomy, so in the sense that they have to import a lot of materials to sustain that sector, which means that all of a sudden, if there is a war with Russia and we can't get gas anymore, we are in trouble because the economy is dependent on those imported resources. So there is a very lack of autonomy and resilience in times of crisis. The second process that we see is that when we plan cities, we tend to try to maximize land productivity. So trying to basically concentrate investments in some key areas in order to make those key areas attractive for investors and therefore generating quite some revenues. And these revenues, of course, part of them are taken by the municipalities and reused for public services. And the third process is that we think at cities as divided into land uses. And this land use definitions, it's very much centered about humans, so the uses for humans, it's very important, and also very much based on property relations, individual property relations. So we categorize land uses also based on how the land is divided. And this is not only in the Netherlands, but actually in other countries much more clear. For example, in Italy, where I come from, where land use is really regulated based on property structures because the municipality doesn't have so much power. This also allows cities to kind of, but makes cities having a difficult time thinking in terms of common property rights. So dividing land in public and private makes it much more hard to think in terms of common property rights. This will come.
What do you mean with human-centered? You mean more private human-centered? Not because human-centered also sounds very good, huh? Human-centered.
Yeah.
But what do you mean with human-centered?
I mean basically functions that are functional to basically the life choices that humans have. That's important. I agree that it's so important. But when we do that, we do not consider, for example, the impact of those activities in biodiversity, in nitrogen cycles, carbon cycles. So we focus a lot on what an area is functional for humans, and therefore we underestimate the impact of that activity on basically non-human entities, in fact, like biodiversity and ecosystem. There are systems like environmental assessments, of course, that we do, but it's basically an assessment of a human-based land use. I hope it will become clear in a second where I will bring some examples. So these are three examples of what I just mentioned. The first, for example, is a monofunctional land use for agriculture for export here in the Netherlands. It's very familiar images, of course. It's a very, very basically low diversity, if you think, economy. It's very specialized. Land use, it's very low in diversity. This is called also a green desert. You might see green, but the biodiversity level is very low. And it's extremely non-resilient. The second is an example of a plan, which, by the way, might not be realized nowadays because things are changing. But one way to basically concentrate investments in one area in order to maximize land productivity and to attract investors. It's one way to do that process. And the third one, you see a typical case of greening, completely a facility. I guess, I hope you're not a fan of Boeri.
I had it also in my presentation.
Okay, it's very.
I think there are similar pictures, but
yeah,
that's good.
but this is because this is such an extreme case, no? It's an extreme case is a very high value area where basically we put trees on it and we make it a flagship project for the whole world and famous all over the place. But in fact, this is a completely human-centered way of greening, of course. The nature here requires high maintenance. That's why if you go now to Milan, it would not look like this. It would look much uglier. And it's a natural environment that is completely non-resilient.
Yeah, and also if you know how many concrete and materials go in there to make this possible.
Exactly, yeah.
It's also highly doubtful.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed.
But nice picture.
It's not my picture. I don't even know who made it, but it's Creative Commons, so. So, okay, let's think about these three processes in terms of degrowth. So, as I said, lack of autonomy. I think as a target, we should try to strive for more, increasing the autonomy of city regions. This means autonomy in terms of, in fact, material demands, resources of energy, but also trying to overlap those flows with political responsibilities. If we look at now the system, we know that the state has almost little power on the import of energy, as we saw with Ukraine and Russia. That we need to strive to overlap these three. things. And the concept of bioregionalism, maybe you know about this term, has been used a lot, bioregionalism, to really talk about this, the overlap of the material, the energy, the ecosystemic properties, and the political organization, trying to rebalance these four things within the same space. And I think regional scale is pretty good to do that. I think in terms of regionally produced food, but also energy, or regionally processed waste also, this kind of scalar readjustment. Second, this means also, of course, making urban consumption and production smaller, because we can't extract infinite amount of resources locally or at the regional level, but also mean to close material loops. And here we bring in the circular economy, I think, model. It's a model that I think can fit very well the degrowth agenda in terms of creating autonomy in the production of the built environment as much as possible, instead of importing materials everywhere. So the idea, for example, the material passports for buildings, I think was interesting because it kind of gives an inventory of all the materials that are already in the city and that we can reuse for buildings. So having basically a fully local sector of the construction chain, I think is extremely important. And of course, sufficiency is the term here that identifies this autonomy. We can't grow infinitively if we are autonomous, because the space is limited. So we need to think in terms of basic human needs and what is sufficiency, what is sufficient in order to live well. This opens up all kind of boxes in terms of what is, for example, the square meters we want to have per capita, what is the facilities that we want to share or we need to privatize in housing, what is the amount of roads that are necessary for the functioning of the city. So when we think in terms of sufficiency, we can open these questions. These are just two examples of how these ideas can be realized at different scales. Bioregions in Europe is actually a term that is used in the European Union. It identifies somehow a middle level between countries and Europe to show that there is areas of Europe that have similar biophysical, ecological properties that can be, in fact, thought together beyond nation-state boundaries. I'm not going to go into that too much, but it's an interesting way to divide Europe into areas of material and ecosystemic sufficiency, I think. The other example is an example I was involved in, is one of the few housing cooperatives that are starting in Amsterdam. This is the New Maint. I helped to set it up. When we set it up, that we really thought in terms of sufficiency and autonomy. Like, of course, we didn't dig the sand ourselves or the wood that will go into the building, but the way the building functions with solar panels, the water, and the sharing of facilities is very much oriented to basically people there taking care of their existence, in fact, in the building, as much as possible to reduce the incoming of materials and the come and go out of waste. So it's from a small scale of the housing, you can also think in terms of international scale. And of course, there are all kind of in-between levels I think we can think about. Now, the second logic I think we should consider is that of affinity. So here comes a bit of a debate, in fact, because it sounds like quite socialist, like to set limits everywhere. I'm not going to go into that discussion now, but we can discuss later, of course. But here, I think we should think at cities in terms of what are the minimum and maximum standards that fit the environmental targets and the social targets. So this allows us to think in terms of what is excess in cities today. Where we find excess? Where can we see it? And where can we reduce it? I think there are hardly any policy in cities that does that explicitly, except in one sector, which is car use. So in car use, we see cities think in terms of what is non-necessary driving. I think that type of thinking is good, and we need to extend it to also other sectors. So building, of course, and also green space, what is non-necessary but useful green space, where can we rearrange that balance. I think it's very important to think in those terms, because it allows to also activate redistribution of wealth, as I said. So taking from where it's too much and putting back where it's not enough. These are two examples, again, a bit extremes of how this finity thinking can work. They are already existing. I mean, one is this campaign in Berlin that gained a lot of momentum, and it was thinking in terms of what is excess house property. They basically targeted a big real estate investment company that owned more than 200,000 units in Berlin. They say that's too much. We cannot have this. We cannot have this type of, because it inflates the market and it creates all kind of development cycles that are not, and vacancies that are not indeed socially just and also environmentally reasonable. So this is one of the cases. In the Netherlands, actually, there are already some tools that we can use, like the point system that has been now a bit enlarged, and the limits to reselling property or to the obligation to live in it. These kind of things, I think, are very good. There are tools, regulatory tools that planners can use. And the other side, it's just an image of, all these boundaries that, in this case, Schiphol, you see the Schiphol aviation area, the pink one, that's the noise, but there are also all kind of other boundaries of activities that are kind of having an impact on the surrounding areas. This is an environmental impact assessment, but still I think we can use those tools to really say, okay, this needs to be reduced massively. This needs to be downscaled. There is no space anymore for 400,000 flights in Amsterdam. We need to reduce. And I think this kind of thinking is typical of degrowth. Now, many people will not like to talk about this, like the Schiphol airport, but I think we can talk about it later, by the way. I think it's a very good case of low social value of a very high impact activity. 70% of the flights are connection flights. And basically 10% of the flyers cover 50% of the flights. So it's extremely unequal environmental impact, which I think for cities extremely important to deal. And the last one, maybe we'll go back to the point of the more than human approach. And here it's what's the most open for me. So I think we should start thinking in terms of habitat in cities. So when I look at what a habitat is, from the space sciences and geosciences, they define it as the capacity of a particular physical space to support the activity of an organism, in this case humans, that is to provide the set of resources and conditions required for its way of life. Now, this is a very general definition. But if we look at how this term has been used in planning and design so far, I think we see a problem. Think about the term of livability that we used a lot to measure the performance of urban space. We have these graphs with all the different indicators of livability. Those indicators are extremely human-centered and extremely knowledge-centered. Basically, we say a space that scores very high in livability is one that allows us to have a lot of social relations, to interact well, to move well, but it says nothing about the food we eat, the clothes we use, how we eat our houses, and also the bacteria that we use to protect our bodies, our intestines. All these properties that allow us as humans to survive are not taken into consideration by these models. That's why we make cities smart, but not ecological, just to give you an idea. I think really we need to get back into what allows humans to survive, and it's not social media. It's food, it's good food, and it's good biodiversity, and it's good ecosystems. That needs to be brought back in cities as much as possible, I think. So I give you two examples, which I could find, and I think were very interesting, also two different scales. One is a neighborhood scale. This is a colleague of mine, Urbania Huve. They mapped the foodscape of a neighborhood. So they try to think in terms of, okay, what is the food source in this neighborhood? Where can we get food, good food from this neighborhood? And it's not about one garden. It's about really thinking about urban fabric as producing fabrics for human survival. And it's not about, again, just public space and interaction. It's about the basic material needs. The other is, again, a larger scale, and this is a region in Colombia where many producers, farmers, have gathered together to say, we are going to provide 100% of the food of this region from our land. And we're going to organize a food sovereignty process. So think in terms of region as spaces for food production and autonomy. I think this is also very relevant for the Netherlands, where 80% of food is exported, and where it's necessary to downscale that and to use what is left for the autonomy of the, I think, of the people living there. So these are two examples to think in terms of habitat. So in terms of property that allow human survival. Just to recap, and then I'm done. Degrowth, an imaginary of planning or design, it says few things. First, we need to reduce the metabolism of cities. It's not just about renewables and green, it's about reducing the amount of materials necessary for cities to function. We need to increase the material autonomy of cities and also the way we deal with those materials. So try to use cities as mines indeed, and also slow down the consumption within cities to make that possible. To do that, I think we should think in terms of finity, so principles of land use that think in terms of boundaries, maximum boundaries that we should not overtake or overshoot. The donut is one step in that direction. I hope it will be used good in the next years by the municipality. That allows us to to take from excess and redistribute where it's not enough, so the redistribution of excess. And to do that, I think it's important to rethink urban space and spatial relations in a way that is in balance or synergic or regenerative with ecosystem properties. So not only about the brain of people, but also the stomach and the skin and all these properties allow them to survive. And so I hope to have given a good overview of a very rich, I would say, debate. If you want to read more, there are two publications that I would suggest you to read. That's from me, but there are many others, of course. I'm going to do self-promotion, but it's really as I said, there's not many people working on this, and I think so. Many of those are in this book. Many of those people working on degrowth in cities, and there is also an article where I discuss more in complex terms all these things I said in the second part of the talk. Thank you very much, and I hope we can have a nice discussion.
Thanks.
Nice.